Before tanks, before gunpowder, before modern armies marched across continents, there were the legions of the Roman Empire. Men in iron helmets, shields locked together like a wall of steel, sandals grinding through mud and dust. For 25 years they marched across deserts, forests, and mountains. They conquered kingdoms and crushed rebellions. Yet every soldier secretly feared one question more than the enemy's sword. Not, will I die, but something far more unsettling. What happens if I survive? For many Roman soldiers, the real tragedy of war did not begin on the battlefield. It began after the war was over. The Roman legion was one of the most powerful military machines in human history. Ancient writers like Tacitus and Cassius Dio described them with awe. Disciplined, relentless, and terrifyingly efficient. Wherever the legions marched, from the forests of Germania to the deserts of Syria, from the hills of Hispania to the cold frontier of Britannia, Rome expanded its power. But armies require something incredibly valuable: young men willing to give their lives. To convince them, Rome offered a promise. When a recruit joined the army, he was offered a dream: serve faithfully for 25 years, and Rome would reward you with land, wealth, and honor. Under the rule of Augustus, a special treasury called the Aerarium Militare was created to fund these pensions. Veterans could receive huge cash payments or farmland somewhere within the empire. For a poor young man with few prospects, the offer sounded irresistible. Survive the wars and you could retire as a respected landowner. But reality inside the legions was brutal. Only about 2/3 of soldiers survived long enough to retire. Roughly 1 in 3 died before reaching the end of their service. Some died in battle, others from disease. Yet the most relentless enemy was time. Roman soldiers marched nearly 30 miles a day carrying over 60 pounds of equipment: armor, shield, weapons, and tools. They did this not for weeks or months, but for decades. They slept on the ground, endured poor food, and fought campaign after campaign. By the time a soldier finally reached retirement age, often in his 40s, his body was already breaking down. Years of marching destroyed their knees, armor crushed their backs, endless combat ruined their shoulders, and then there were the wounds of war: sword cuts, arrow strikes, spear wounds, and skull fractures from sling stones were common. Roman military surgeons were surprisingly skilled. They could remove arrowheads, set bones, and even perform amputations. But medicine had limits. They could not restore a lost hand or eye, and they could not repair decades of physical damage. Some soldiers left the army early through a medical discharge called missio causaria. On the surface it sounded merciful. If you were too injured to continue fighting, Rome allowed you to leave. But there was a cruel catch. Leaving early meant receiving only a fraction of the pension you were promised. A soldier who lost his leg defending Rome might walk away with almost nothing. In the ancient world, a crippled veteran had very few options for survival. Even those who completed their full service often discovered that Rome's reward was disappointing. Veterans were frequently settled on remote frontier land in places like Pannonia, Britannia, or near the dangerous borderlands of Germania. These were not peaceful retirement communities. Many of the farms were located in swamps, mountains, or barren soil that barely produced crops. Ancient sources reveal how bitter soldiers felt about this. After the death of Augustus in AD 14, legions stationed in Pannonia mutinied. These were experienced veterans who had served for decades. One soldier named Pausanias spoke for many when he complained that after years of bloodshed, Rome rewarded them with nothing but swamps and mountains. Technically, they had received land. In reality, the land was almost useless. Some soldiers never received retirement at all. During times of crisis, Rome simply refused to release them from service. The official term might have been 25 years, but many soldiers remained trapped in the army for 30 or even 40 years. Their reward for surviving was simply more war. Others were discharged but never received their promised payment because the imperial treasury was empty. And an aging veteran with no political connections had no way to challenge the emperor's decision. For the veterans who did manage to settle somewhere, civilian life could feel strangely foreign. Roman soldiers had spent their entire adult lives under military discipline. They had been told when to march, when to eat, when to sleep. During service, they were not legally allowed to marry, meaning many left the army without families. According to the historian Tacitus, some veteran colonies struggled to survive because these former soldiers had little experience with farming or family life. They had been trained for war, not peace. Many veterans drifted back toward their old legionary camps. They lived in small civilian settlements just outside the forts, staying close to the only world they understood. The army had been their family for decades. Without it, many felt lost. There were also wounds that could not be seen. Ancient texts describe veterans suffering from uncontrollable rage, despair, and violent behavior, symptoms that resemble what modern psychology would call trauma. The writer Aelian tells the story of a veteran named Cestius Macedonicus, who burned himself alive when enemies threatened his town. Other inscriptions mention soldiers overwhelmed by anger and grief from years of violence. After 25 years of war, many simply could not return to normal life. Rome's failure to care properly for its veterans may even have weakened the empire itself. By the 3rd century, financial crises forced emperors to reduce pensions and benefits. Citizens noticed that the reward for military service was shrinking. Fewer young Romans were willing to enlist. As recruitment declined, the empire increasingly relied on foreign mercenaries who fought for pay rather than loyalty. Over time, the discipline and unity that once defined the Roman legions began to erode. In the end, most Roman veterans faded quietly into history. Some struggled as farmers. Some tried their luck as merchants. Others drank away their remaining years. A few died alone on distant frontier lands far from the homes they had left decades earlier. The Roman war machine was incredibly efficient at transforming young men into soldiers, but it was far less capable of turning those soldiers back into ordinary men once the fighting ended. 2,000 years ago, a Roman legionary marched across continents carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders. He fought in brutal battles, endured endless hardship, and somehow survived. Yet when the wars were over, Rome moved on. The empire remembered its victories, its emperors, and its conquests. But the aging soldiers who made those victories possible were mostly forgotten. And even after 2 millennia, their story still echoes quietly through the ruins of the ancient world.